I'm Tommy Salmons. This is year zero. As promised, getting a legal analysis on all the good stuff we have going on in society today. I obviously invited my favorite attorney, Michael Harris. How's it going, Michael?
Doing great. Feeling great.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So, how are you? How are you? You still doing okay with the lockdown?
Well, Dallas County says that dealing with people in Dallas County jail is a quote unquote essential government function. So I have been functioning during the pandemic shutdown. But it's a new world that we're living in legally. We're still adjusting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I thought, yeah. Didn't they cancel the courts?
They have canceled all jury trials in the state of Texas. I can't speak about other states, but we got an order from the state of Texas that we're not to have any jury trials at least till the month of August.
Okay, okay. Well, I mean, they didn't. I know the border closings at Louisiana. They didn't last very long. Um, that I, we, I think maybe 3 weeks it lasted, and it was just kind of like even before they announced that they were opening the borders back up. It's like the cops just quit showing up to to the borders. I was just kind of like, okay, well, I guess that's over. The I guess laws only. I've heard it said that laws only count if they're willing to enforce them, and I guess they just lost the will to run those checkpoints.
There is a lot of truth in the fact of legislature says one thing, but police enforcement on the streets says something entirely different. And I mean, frankly, I think most police officers, the last thing they want to do during the pandemic is fill up their jails with potential patients. And they're terrified of COVID-19 or whatever virus just going through the jail population because it's really hard to practice social distancing in a jail facility.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
that's
can tell you that the Texas state prisons, they are not picking up people from Dallas County during the pandemic.
oh really?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. So we've had a few cases where people they got prison sentences, but because they had a large amount of back time that applied towards their and they got a minimum sentence, so they have actually already served up their time, but yet they can't be discharged from the Dallas County Jail because they had not been processed by the state system. And it's kind of like, hey, we've already served out our time now. So I have not had that come up in any of my cases, but I have heard some other attorneys talk about that happening now.
Oh wow. My wife used to work for an attorney in Beaumont, and she still communicates with him and keeps in touch with him. And he had mentioned to her that when all the lockdown first came around, that the police were basically ordered to stop arresting people for theft and to only focus on drug and DUI convictions. And I thought that was strange. I was like, well, so people can go around stealing cars or breaking into homes, and the police are just going to turn the other cheek, so to speak, but they're going to continue to seek out drug and DUI convictions. And I was like, that just seems kind of backwards to me, but okay.
That's very backwards to basically Dallas County was practically the opposite. It's kind of like, hey, don't waste time filling up our jails with people on low level drug cases. We want you to focus on domestic violence calls because people are locked down.
Right.
But I mean, a lot of law enforcement is really local politics. So
Yeah, that might have been a Beaumont thing. I don't know if that was just a Beaumont thing or what, but I just know that's what had been passed along to me.
I can pretty much guarantee you that law enforcement and local politics are inseparable. There is, yeah, there is. I mean, I can tell you stories about that if you want me to, about local pressure has a big say in how law enforcement does their jobs.
Well, I mean, well, this is a good transition because that's what we're on the phone to talk about today, anyways. The the police brutality and the reaction to police brutality that we're seeing all across the country at this moment. And I've said that George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back. That this is something that's been going on for decades. This isn't something new. And anybody who acts like this is a new phenomenon is just blind or ignorant, one of the two. And so one of the things I've always said, and that you've brought up to me, is how do you is every person, including officers, being being treated equally under the law? How could we go about implementing that, and why is it not like that? Why is there such a disparity in like the two levels of law that we're dealing with?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's really no way to get around the fact that there is a dollar sign on law enforcement, okay? But I mean, there's nothing new to the idea of marginal groups tend to see police officers as oppressors rather than protectors or code enforcers. I mean, that goes all the way back to the book of Exodus with the Hebrews in ancient Egypt, okay? That is absolutely nothing new about that.
Right.
But to bring it to modern day America, to me, there's no reason why police officers should not be judged by the same set of laws when it comes to wrongdoing as ordinary citizens. I mean, we already have in the Texas Penal Code defenses for necessity, mistake of fact, self-defense, or defense of a third person. And I see no reason why law enforcement should not be judged by the same standards.
Well, can you break
And
down? Okay, can you break down necessity and mistake of fact? I think self-defense and defense of a third person speaks for itself. But can you
well,
kind of give us a breakdown of what necessity and mistake of fact actually is?
well, I mean, mistake of fact would be I there's a well-known case right now in the Houston area where the police officers saw a kid with a toy gun, and the police officer immediately just pulled out a gun and just plugged the kid,
Right.
claiming, "Hey, I thought it was a real gun." I
Hmm.
mean, I mean, no question he overreacted and should have investigated in more detail. But I think just on a purely theoretical point, he could say, "Hey, that was a legitimate mistake of fact that I thought the toy gun was a real gun." All right. Uh, Now, as far as necessity, it's a legal principle of I broke the law, but I did so for a higher purpose. I can tell you that I had, just for example, one case that I had years ago where I was appointed to represent a guy who was holding, they said he had illegal drugs, which some of the drugs were legal, but he had to have a prescription to hold them. And I showed the jury is kind of like it was his brother's medication. And his family wanted my guy to hold his brother's medication because they thought his brother would just overdose on the pills. And so I made the argument to the jury that this was a textbook case of the necessity law. And so the jury found the guy not guilty. Uh,
Okay.
One of my moments in glory as a public defender. Okay. So don't get many, but that was one of the ones. So that would be the best example that I have encountered in my 20 years of handling court appointments of a necessity. Does that make things clearer?
Yes. Yeah. No.
Okay.
Absolutely. So when you have a situation, and I don't now, do you know if all these reasonings does necessity, mistake of fact, all this translate to most other states, or is this just Texas that we're talking about here?
Well, I mean, I'm licensed to practice law in Texas and federal courts and no other, but I think the basic concepts are pretty much
Universal.
nationwide. They're all mentioned in what's called the Model Penal Code,
Okay.
but each state has their kind of like variations. Louisiana has a bunch of variations. Okay, so, but I think the basic principles are pretty well nationwide.
That actually makes me laugh because when I remember going to traffic court once when I was like, I don't know, 18, 19 years old, and the judge kept comparing Harris County to Louisiana parishes, and he's like, if you were in Louisiana, you would perish. That's why they call it a parish and not a county. So that's kind of funny. I don't remember the entire spill. It was a good 10 minutes. It was pretty funny. It was actually one of the few judges I've stood in front of that I thought was actually entertaining. Um,
Well, I've been in front of a lot of judges that were entertaining, so yeah, it's thing of they treat me differently than you. I'm certain.
I would
Okay.
imagine. I would imagine.
Yeah.
But
I
okay,
mean,
so
I
now
love you, Tommy, but I mean, I don't think all the judges appreciate the Chris Stapleton look. Okay, so
thank you. Yeah. Okay. So the reason I was asking about the mistake of fact in other states is it made me think of the Daniel Shaver case when he was shot in the hallway of that hotel room, or of that hotel, and the he was a pest control guy, and he was cleaning his a pellet gun in the window of the hotel, and somebody called the police saying that he was aiming a rifle. And even though Arizona is an open carry state, they sent a SWAT team there, or a unit of very well armored and armed police officers there that were ready to shoot first and ask questions later. And as he's crawling down the hall begging for his life, his bicycle shorts got caught under his knee. And when he went to grab his shorts, one of the officers opened fire and executed him in the hallway.
I
So,
wouldn't be surprised.
yeah.
And I can tell you about another case that I had. I was appointed to represent this guy for felony drug. He was involved in a marijuana transporting ring, and literally he's called when they're trying to arrest him. They're pursuing him in black SUVs, and we have this great 911 call where he's calling up 911. There's people in black SUVs. They're trying to run me off the road. They're trying to kill me, because he thought they were like his drug competitors, people who worked for his boss's competitors that were trying to execute him.
Mm-hmm.
And so he calls up 911 and says these people in black SUVs are after him. They're trying to run him off the road. You got to send the police. You got to send the police. And they're like, sir, those are the police. Like, no, they're not. Like, yes, they are. Those are agents with the Drug Enforcement Agency. And he goes, you send somebody in a marked police car with overhead lights on, and I will pull over. But until then, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
And so, they did actually charge him with a Dallas County offense of evading arrest with a vehicle because of that. Now, I wouldn't point on that particular part of the case, but I think that would have been a mistake of fact case of that if that had gone further.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's also important to bring out, though, that when I make the argument that law enforcement should be judged by the same set of rules, I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with the Waco Branch Davidian siege
Yes, sir.
that happened. And most people don't know this, but first of all, there were survivors of the compound attack that were charged with crimes of shooting the ATF agents.
Yes, sir.
And the defense lawyers made the argument that those survivors acted in self-defense, even though it was law enforcement. They were entitled to use deadly weapons to defend themselves against the ATF agents. And a Texas jury found those people not guilty.
Yeah, there was a guy. There was also a guy a couple of years ago. I can't remember his name, and the SWAT team was executing a no-knock raid, came in his home without announcing themselves, and he killed 3 officers and he just recently, like I said, it was like 2 or 3 years ago, he got off, and they found him not guilty um, for murdering police officers because because of the castle doctrine, he was defending his home.
Yes.
So yeah, there's actually a precedent in Texas for that, and that's one of the good things about Texas, that at least they do recognize that there is the opportunity to defend yourself against police in at least those situations when they're coming into your home. But
Yes.
but this brings us to our next point that we wanted to discuss, and this is probably going to get a little more detailed, is qualified immunity and how a lot of these police officers are getting off. And I said when the with Derek Chauvin and the George Floyd situation that there was very little precedent for him to claim qualified immunity in this case. That there was no way he was going to claim that he feared for his life while this man was handcuffed and being held down by two other officers, while Derek Chauvin, a man that knew him previously, had his knee on his neck until he died. So, but there are a lot of officers, like in that Daniel Shaver case that I brought up, that even though the officer had "you're fucked" written on the barrel of his rifle, which they didn't allow into evidence because it may prejudice a jury, he was he was actually got off with qualified immunity, which actually, as you have pointed out to me, does act as unqualified impunity in many cases. So what can we learn about qualified immunity?
Well, I mean, first of all, I do want to say that I got the phrase qualified immunity smacks of unqualified impunity from Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor. Okay, so yeah, it's only plagiarism in law school, but I do want to cite where I got that from, and in particular, I mean, since you brought up the George Floyd situation, I think it's very important to point out the actual crime that he was accused of committing was counterfeiting a $20 bill. All right. Now, there's a long-standing history that police officers or law enforcement is allowed to use deadly force to arrest somebody for a felony.
Mm-hmm.
However, let's keep in mind in Old English common law, there were only like 5 felonies like rape, murder, burglary, stuff like that.
Right.
And the punishment for all of them was the death penalty if you were convicted. Okay. I really have a hard time believing that they had in mind of somebody counterfeiting a $20 bill, even though technically it is a felony under current American law, but using that as a justification for using deadly force against an unarmed man who wasn't in any, from far as I know, was not threatening law enforcement or anybody else in the public at all.
And when you look at the situation, the way that it came down, it looked like he was waiting for law enforcement to show up. Maybe he didn't even know that it was counterfeit until it was pointed out to him. And
it's entirely possible. We will never know, really.
Right.
I mean, it would not stun me if he didn't really actually the one handling the $20 bill, that they kind of like created that story to cover their tracks, to create what the technical term is plausible deniability.
Right.
I mean, I hope the facts come out in more detail about that. I think the main things, which we can go into more details about it later, but this particular case, I think this officer is going to have a hard time arguing for qualified immunity. Now, as far as the whole doctrine of qualified immunity, it's very important to point out that there is no piece of legislation whatsoever that was approved by Congress or signed off by the president creating qualified immunity. It is 100% created by the courts.
Mm-hmm.
They had no historical justification for whatever. They basically created the doctrine, the Supreme Court, or we in the legal community refer to it as SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States.
Right.
So just for simplicity, I'm just going to say SCOTUS
Hmm.
created this doctrine in the 1967 case, Pearson versus Ray. Basically, give you a short history lesson here, folks. That was a case of during the civil rights movement era, a bunch of clergymen, black and white, in the South were trying to create case law precedent. So they got together, and I think they intentionally tried to set up to where they would get arrested for some offense. And in the process, they filed a civil rights lawsuit, a civil lawsuit against the municipal judge in, I think it was the state of Mississippi. And that got taken up on appeal. And the United States Supreme Court said, look, it's wrong to have people involved who are performing government functions to face a lawsuit for what the law might possibly be. Now, there's a big difference between facing a civil lawsuit and facing a criminal charge.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, I kind of see where the Supreme Court was going in 1967. It's kind of like, hey, we don't want people just performing routine government functions to face a lot of civil lawsuits for basically doing their job. And I can tell you, as a public defender, I have made the claim of qualified immunity for doing my job. Okay, so I had one of those Republic of Texas guys that included me in his lawsuit for doing my job as a public, doing what basically I was appointed to do. And so, I made the argument of, hey, I should have qualified immunity here, not have to face a civil lawsuit. So, full disclosure on that.
Right.
However, it was kept and like I said, this was never approved by Congress. It was solely created by the Supreme Court in 1967. And things really started to change at least from the research I've done. Was a case in late 2004. I'm not good at French, but it was Brosseau versus Hagen, where basically the Supreme Court, for all practical purposes, says you can use deadly force. Police officers can use deadly force and not have to face a jury at all. And so very few exceptions. And that was really the case where things started to dramatically change. And the thing that I find ironic about that case, it came down in December of 2004. It was what they call a per curiam opinion, which is kind of legal way of saying nobody wanted to put their name on it. So we don't even technically know who wrote the opinion.
Oh, okay.
However, it's got William Rehnquist basically written all over it.
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Really, William Rehnquist was one of my least favorite Supreme Court justices. I mean, the person in the Nixon administration who first recommended him as a Supreme Court justice said that William Rehnquist would basically write an opinion justifying the sheriff of Nottingham. He was so fanatically pro-police officer, and it's pretty obvious that was the reason why Nixon chose him to be on the Supreme Court to begin with. And
let me just point out one thing, and I think this is important because what gets so confusing or so mind blowing, I guess you could say, in these situations is that the exact people, and we're talking the conservatives or the more right winger style of political voices, always point out that they do not want the Supreme Court legislating from the bench. Yet we've already covered that Congress had nothing to do with qualified immunity. This was never legislated from Congress. This is ultimately legislation from the bench, from the Supreme Court. And now it is the doctrine in many cases of the conservative movement and what they use to defend police officers. And I think that is a very important point to bring up.
Oh yes, it's always a thing of the two-party system. It's practically two tribal party system, to be blatantly honest about it now. And it's kind of like they make a lot of noise about how they don't want justices legislating from the bench
I think I'm giving up on.
unless it's our way, unless they're going to rule our way.
Yeah, I think I'm going to
Okay.
give up on calling them tribes, though. I think I'm going to call them death cults from now on.
There's some justification in that to be. Yeah, 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 and it's I I think they've totally destroyed the whole process of picking Supreme Court justices, which some other time, if you want me to go on a tangent of how I think we can fix that problem, I will, but I don't see that changing now. The ironic thing is there are two justices, even before George Floyd happened, that made it clear that they wanted to address the whole issue of qualified immunity. Ironically, one of them is one of the most liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor, and one of the most conservative justices, Clarence Thomas. Now, I personally think it's no coincidence that one of them is Hispanic and the other one is African American. Okay, I'm
Right.
sorry, but I think that is no coincidence that those are the two justices who had signaled before this that they did want to reconsider it.
Well, and it looks
And
like just from some articles I've read that they are looking at revisiting the qualified immunity in the in using seven modern cases as precedent at a later time this year whenever they reconvene. I can't remember exactly when that's supposed to be, but it is gonna. I want to say it was October, but I'm not real. I can't really remember. But they
well, it's
they
pretty
are
much
they are
first
planning
week
on
of
looking at
October.
it.
Yeah, first week of October is generally when Supreme Court uh, term starts.
Okay.
Now, we don't know if pandemic is going to change that or not. And I mean, let's be blunt. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not long for this world. Okay, so we don't know what kind of effect that's going to happen on the Supreme Court. But Sotomayor has been the one who has been the most vocal. She uses phrases like qualified immunity, quote, sanctioning a shoot first, think later approach, and she's very, very hostile to it. Uh, Clarence Thomas, his main beef is the fact that there was absolutely no historical precedent for it. But he has on a few occasions pointed to an African American defendant and said, "There, but by the grace of God, go I." Not very many, but there have been a few times. Now, it is important to say that there's been this movement going on to challenge qualified immunity before the George Floyd, and let's just call it an execution, because I mean it was a murder.
Yeah,
Which I mean,
I don't think there's
I
any
think
way
as a
around
lawyer,
that.
I think it's kind of like I think we need to let the process take place. But uh, the killing, we'll just use the phrase the killing, okay? And but in starting in 2018, there was a coalition of think tanks who were trying to press the issue through the courts. Cato was in the lead of it, but also the Second Amendment Foundation was a part of it. The American Civil Liberties Union is a part of it. A few other think tanks I can't think of name off the top of my head. And it is also important to point out that Congressman Justin Amash has filed a bill in Congress on May 30th of this year to officially put an end. Uh, I have serious doubts that the Senate will take up his bill, even if it does pass the House of Representatives. But I am curious to watch and see if it'll even get through the House of Representatives or not.
Yeah, well, and it makes me question: can can Congress is Congress going to be able to take this on when again it wasn't legislated by Congress, it was legislated from the bench? So are are we willing to give Congress the, even if it is a good cause, do you want to set a precedent that Congress can start making diktats on how judges should rule on cases. Is that a good thing?
Well, our legal tradition is local legislatures are in the best position to determine standards for the local community.
Yeah.
Okay, that has been a long-standing tradition, and I think the biggest problem that we have right now is that Congress wants to look good. And so they come up with these Elizabeth Warren grand plans where bureaucracies administered by the president are going to solve all the problems, whatever it is, whether it's health care or hair loss or whatever. It's kind of like Elizabeth Warren's got this grand plan that the federal government is going to take over and do everything, and it's kind of like, oh well, yeah, but we're going to have nameless, faceless bureaucrats, aka the deep state, actually kind of like figure out the nuts and bolts of how they're going to do it. And oh, by the way, Congress, you're putting the president of the United States officially in charge of this. So to me, it hasn't been so much. See, America's founders, they were very concerned about an overreaching executive.
Right.
And so that their hope was, when they created the Constitution, was it's kind of like they would have two houses of Congress that would be try to prevent president executive from overreaching. Well, it seems to me, and I think George Will, conservative commentator, brings this up very, very well. Congressmen today, so they are so determined to look good to their base that they just hand all the power over to the presidents with no oversight whatsoever. And I think that's a big part of the problem that we have today, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like at least half the country is convinced that when these politicians are running as dictators, which is what they're doing, saying I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, yeah, that half the country wants them to be dictators. And so that it causes a lot of issue as well
Well, they want them to be dictators for their agenda.
for their cause.
And
Yes.
yeah, for their cause and their agenda. It's exactly like I call it the feminist and Bill Clinton. If you ask women what are the things they hated about men, they hate men that lie and cheat and only care about power, yet they love Bill Clinton. Okay, why do they love Bill Clinton? Because he promoted their agenda. And it's kind of, to me, a lot with the evangelical Christians and Donald Trump. In my opinion, a lot of other scholars' opinions, the Sermon on the Mount is probably the most accurate accounting of what the actual Jesus actually preached. And when you read it, Donald Trump is like the poster child of everything it's not. I mean, he's like the polar opposite of the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
Yet evangelicals, they like blindly follow Donald Trump. Why?
Okay.
Because he promotes their political agenda. And so, and I think African Americans see that, and I do. And
Well, and I've heard some ridiculous defenses of Donald Trump from evangelicals when they talk about they want to talk about King Solomon and how he was a sinner and had all these wives, and that God always uses the most imperfect and the most unlikely vessel to move forward his message. So I don't foresee anybody winning a fight against evangelicals on that in that arena. And
no, I don't. I just basically just kind of sarcastically point out, well, then God must have chosen Barack Obama and Bill Clinton as well. Then, okay, so
there you go. Yeah.
yeah, but also, is like I said, the American founding fathers. I mean, I'm a pretty fair amateur historian, and I've done a lot of research in this area, apart from my law practice as well as my personal interest. Most people would be surprised to know this, but America's quote unquote founding fathers really did not agree on very much.
Yeah.
Frankly, a lot of them really didn't like each other. But the one thing they pretty much agreed on was their big fear was that the republic they created would turn into an empire. And there was a few of them that they literally referred to it as the Roman curse,
Yes.
because their dream, they wanted to create what was then a modern day Roman republic. And it's kind of like, how do we prevent this from becoming an empire? Which I'm sorry to say, we are now an empire. And
You have
I
been for
think we
quite a
ought,
while.
yes, we have. And I can't tell you exactly when that started, but to me, when they amended the Posse Comitatus Act, that was when in 2005. That's when there was no doubt anymore. I mean, do you want me to talk about the Posse Comitatus Act?
Yeah, you can talk about posse
Okay.
comitatus.
Yeah, Posse Comitatus. It's a Latin phrase, means the power of the county, and it goes back to Old English common law, where you would have kind of a local sheriff. We'll call him Andy Griffith, say, from the Andy Griffith Show. Uh, there'd be somebody he needed to arrest, so he would round up the able-bodied males to go hunt down and arrest the outlaw. Okay, and so I mean, if you watch Western movies, you'll hear them talk about, round up a posse. And I had to leave town because there was a posse after my tail. Well, that's where that comes from. And so after the Civil War, the uh, the the Federal Army remained in the South for Reconstruction.
Hmm.
And basically, when Rutherford B. Hayes got elected president, it was blindingly obvious that the reason he got elected president was because of the rifles of the Northern Army, the rifles and bayonets of the Roman Army, of the Republican Army. And so that led to the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. That said that you could not use military personnel to enforce domestic policies. So basically, as the military deals with external threats, you do not use the military for local domestic law enforcement purposes. And that was the law until 2006.
Hmm.
In 2006, that's basically the justification they used was Hurricane Katrina. They used the excuse, and I'm sorry, I think it was an excuse, that the reason why the federal government did not respond as they could have was because of the Posse Comitatus Act. Well, that's a bunch of bull. Okay, I'm sorry.
Right.
But that's the excuse they used to amend the Posse Comitatus Act in 2006. And literally, the title they used to the amendment was Use of Armed Forces in Major Public Emergencies. Okay. Now, question number one: who decides what is a major public emergency?
Well, the
Answer: the
the
president
the
does.
Karens
Uh,
do.
does the president have to get any kind of authorization from Congress to declare a major public emergency and bring out the military to use them to enforce a domestic policy? No. And it's kind of like, to me, you stop and think about this for a second. Okay, so December 2004, Supreme Court of the United States just basically says law enforcement can basically, use deadly force anytime they want to and not have to face any accountability for it. And then in 2006, we amend the Posse Comitatus Act to say the President of the United States can call out the military for quote unquote a major public emergency. Is it a coincidence that those two things happen about the same time? I mean, I can't sit here and prove to you that that they were connected somehow, but I just find it awful coincidental that these two legal doctrines suddenly just showed up about the same time.
Right. Well, and it also showed up right in the middle of militarizing the police after, 9/11, 2001. It's probably a fair understanding that if you are going to give the police the the military equipment and the authority to use that equipment against American citizens, that you're going to have to give them some sort of cover for actually doing that. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, yes,
So,
yes.
and then you just look at, as it goes on further, and they started cities began to the I think it was Barack Obama made a deal with Israel to where the police officers of urban areas would travel over to Israel and train with the IDF.
I wouldn't be surprised at all
And
at that.
this was about the same time that you started hearing all the rumblings about former military being considered terrorist threats and enemy combatants, right?
Yes,
So there's this entire um, focus on pushing the this power into the hands of police departments who aren't sufficiently trained to fight insurgencies or combatants, but they are being taught that that's exactly what they're doing. And I've run into this several times having discussions with former police officers online that, well, I've had insurgents that did this. And I'm like, what insurgents? You were in Baltimore. You weren't in Afghanistan. What insurgents are you dealing with? No, you had a United States citizen. And and so when you change that point of view, you're changing their mindset to view the citizenry as enemy combatants. And that's a major issue. And then when you look on top of that and you compound qualified immunity and what they're saying the level of proof is to bring forward charges or these lawsuits against law enforcement is that you have to prove that in that moment they knew that they were violating your rights, right? And so
the current
they
case
make
law
these.
says that you have to prove that they knowingly violated current statutory or case law. That is the current standard that they have to come up with.
Okay.
Which, yeah, that is the current standard. Not only did you, police officer, behave badly, and you don't have to face a jury, but we are going to require your accuser to prove that you intentionally and knowingly violated a current statute. Well, first of all, a lot of this stems from local prosecutors, mayors. They want to have police on their side because police unions carry a great deal of power when it comes to local elections. They can get their members out to vote for candidate Smith versus candidate Jones, for district attorney, for mayor, for city councilman. So local government is very, very keen on being aware of, we don't want to get the local police union mad at us.
Yeah.
Okay. So right off the bat, ordinarily the one who ultimately has the power is the elected district attorney. Okay. Most people think the judge is more powerful than the district attorney, but actually the district attorney can have the judge arrested if he wants to. Okay. So ultimately it's up to the district attorney to decide, am I going to file charges against Officer Barney Fife, say? Okay. So district attorney knows, it's kind of like, yeah, Officer Barney Fife, he's kind of meddlesome and knuckleheaded, and Not entirely certain why Sheriff Taylor wants to keep Barney Fife on the force, but okay, Sheriff Taylor, if you like him, we'll let you keep him, okay? Even though he is a knucklehead and he arrests people for wrong reasons, he's kind of a lovable character, and everybody in the community knows him, so we'll just let that go, okay? But at what point does somebody in the law enforcement world step in? Now, ideally, it would probably be the state attorney general. Well, I can tell you in the state of Texas, our current attorney general, Ken Paxton, I don't mind calling him out. Basically, I wouldn't bet a dime on him ever filing a criminal case against any police officer in the state of Texas, okay? I mean, that's just not going to happen with this guy. And so, I mean, is the federal Attorney General Bill Barr going to come up and bring criminal charges against a police officer as well? I find that I wouldn't bet on money on that either. Okay, so and I think in particular the African American community, they see this, and I think a lot of it does stem from the war on drugs. And if you want me to go talk about that some more, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, I want to get into the war on drugs in here in just a minute, but you had brought up the police unions, and it made me think of the statement that the police union in Minneapolis released. I don't know if you heard about this, but I had found a news story in which the mayor of Minneapolis had been saying that he was had been fighting the police unions, um, trying to get them to drop what is called a warrior style training for the police department, and that he demanded they drop it. And he had basically been going to war with the police union since he had been elected. The police union not only refused and basically told the mayor, you may be the mayor, but we are the ones in charge of policing the streets. They also told him, since you want to make this warrior style training, you want to make it illegal to train our officers in this way, we're going to take this $55,000 a year course and we're going to offer it to any active officer for free at this point, because our officers need to be aware that their first job is getting home safely every night. And that's a major issue, whether that's, I mean, and I can only imagine that that's across the United States. But for a police union to come out and admit that the first thing we're concerned with is the officers getting home safely every night and not protecting and serving the community, even though any libertarian knows that the police are under no diktat to protect the community. You can look around and you can find court cases. Pete Quinones talks about it all the time on Free Man Beyond the Wall. You got Warren versus District of Columbia, yada yada yada. You had the officer in Parkland who refused to go into the school and help the kids, was just reassigned and given his job back. So it's a well set precedent that they are not there to protect us. But for the president of the police union to come out and admit that not only is that not their job, but their job is to go home at night was pretty eye opening to me.
Well, I will say in the state of Texas, I think it's in the state constitution that law enforcement has an obligation to protect the rights of Texas citizens. So a little quirk of Texas law there.
Yeah.
I mean, Washington, D.C. is just an unusual place legally for a number of reasons, going all the way back to Marbury versus Madison. So the odd thing about Washington, D.C. is it is directly under the jurisdiction of the federal government because they are not officially a state.
Right.
And so they don't have a governor that can call out the National Guard or anything like the posse comitatus doctrine whatsoever. So that's the reason. And I think that's part of the reason why the most recent episode of the Trump administration using tear gas and rubber bullets to clear peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square so Donald Trump could have his photo op in front of a church. I mean, I heard an interview of the mayor of Washington D.C. It's kind of like, I had no authority to stop that at all.
Yeah, yeah. He's
And
kind of like, what can I do about it?
yeah,
Really, really, DC is controlled by the federal government. I mean,
yeah.
that's and I don't even understand. I think the mayor is more there as a mouthpiece and just kind of a showpiece more than anything in Washington D.C. because they really have no authority whatsoever.
Well, apparently she can paint Black Lives Matter on the street in front of the White House. So,
well, well, that's individual autonomy there. That has nothing to do with their position of power. All
mhm.
right. Okay. So yes, you have brought up the war on drugs. It is something that every libertarian has spent a lot of time talking about, and it's very important that we continue to talk about it and that we continue to look at it because the war on drugs has been more destructive to um, poorer communities than any other legislation in the United States. So let's get into how the war on drugs has contributed to the police brutality problem that we see to this day.
Oh, I think the war on drugs, the seeds for the current problem were planted during the war on drugs. Now, were there black people oppressed in America before Richard Nixon took office? Yes. Okay. Let's not sugarcoat that. So yes, we do have a long history of African Americans being lynched by white mobs.
Right.
And full disclosure, some of my mother's ancestors were slave owners in Louisiana. Okay, so I mean, I've tried to make amends to that, but part of my work as a public defender is kind of my way of sort of making amends for that. But we'll move forward. Uh, Richard Nixon was the one who officially declared the war on drugs in the after he won the election in 1968. And basically, it was an unusual election from the start because you had George Wallace, who was very much, very obvious a racist and pro segregation. He ran as a third party candidate. Hubert Humphrey was the Democrat candidate. They split the opposition. Richard Nixon ran on this combination of law and order and peace with dignity in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of like those are his big things. So, his big, he when he got elected, right off the bat, he realized he had two major opponents. And Richard Nixon did not believe in loyal opposition. Richard Nixon saw the word's loyal opposition as an oxymoron. He saw he had two major groups. One was the anti-war left. The other was the African Americans.
The civil rights movement. Yeah.
The civil rights movement, the African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew that he could not get away with coming out with legislation and policies that were blatantly against the anti-war and against the blacks. So he was looking for what is an issue and a set of policies that I can get and I promote that's going to make me look like I'm doing something with law and order, when in reality I'm kind of attacking the anti-war left who smoke marijuana and African Americans who use heroin.
Right.
Bingo, war on drugs. Not only that's kind of like, gee, what's my legal justification under the Constitution for doing all this? Oh, gee, heroin and marijuana, they are imported from outside America. So, protecting borders and interstate commerce. So that gives me justification to do that. And so that has led to, and one of his top people named John Ehrlichman, you can look it up. He later he got caught up in the Watergate scandal. He was an active participant in it. He got convicted of a felony, and he got pretty hacked off when Nixon didn't pardon him afterwards too. But he has on multiple occasions before he died come out and publicly said that the whole war on drugs was racist to begin with, that they knew from the very, very start it was not going to be effective, and it would have been better off to have treated it as a public health issue instead of a law enforcement issue. However, Nixon had to find something to make it look like he was the law and order president. And so that really ramped up the war on drugs from the beginning. And racial profiling was a part of it from the very beginning. And it was no secret. They tried to pretend it wasn't, but it was pretty well. Now, as the war on drugs began to really take off, you had more and more case law coming down, giving police more and more authority in quote unquote high crime areas. So then I stop and ask yourself, what is the definition of a high crime area? What is it that makes one area a high crime area versus a low crime area? Well, a high crime area is where poor people live. Okay. I mean, rich people, they have drug dealers too, okay? We call them doctors, okay? Rich people tend to go to licensed medical providers who give them Percocet and hydrocodone and all kinds of Oxycontin, all kinds of fun stuff that's perfectly legal, okay? Right. Poor people can't do that. People like George Floyd cannot do that. Okay?
Well, there was a reason that the CIA flooded, poor African communities with cocaine and not rich upper class white communities.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure they were selling them to their Republican friends, but that's another story altogether.
Well, that's the thing of rich white Republicans. What drugs do they use? Alcohol, tobacco. Those drugs are legal, and so we can do those. But the drugs used by the anti-war hippies, marijuana, the drugs preferred by poor African Americans, cocaine and heroin, we're really going to crack down on that. And actually they were very clever. They managed to go to Hollywood film producers and convince them to start putting out scripts where the drug dealer was the villain.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And so that's, if your audience is really interested, there's a good book. I'll take a moment to give him a shout out. It's by a name named Dan Baum, B-A-U-M. The title of the book is Smoke and Mirrors. He did an excellent job of documenting the history of that. You can get it on Amazon.com. I don't get any royalties from them or anything like that, but just recommend it as a good book.
Okay.
But what that ultimately led to was that the local media and national media, they were brought in as part of it. It's the thing that they tended to run when a crime story would happen. They tended to run the police and prosecutor version of the crime story without question.
Yeah.
And they conveniently covered up the late night no-knock SWAT raids where people just happened to get shot, and kind of like we had our informant said that this person lived at this address, but it turns out that this person lived across the street, and we're so sorry about that. We had the wrong address, or we had the address where this person lived like 5 years ago.
Right.
And it is also should point out that when Nixon was coming up with his war on drugs, the owner and editor of the Washington Post, her son was a Washington D.C. police officer, and that's something that Dan Baum brings out. Said that she played a major role in privately promoting the whole war on drugs because her son was a police officer. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Now, full disclosure, the guy I grew up with, like a brother to me, he's a police officer in West Texas. And I have a cousin whose son's a police officer in New Orleans. So I don't think I'm just automatically anti-police officer. I'm just kind of like but I've seen a lot in my 20 years as a public defender. My dad used to joke, it's kind of like he raised us both, and he liked to joke and toward the end of his life, it's kind of, I raised one to be a police officer and I raised the other to be a public defender. Like, what on earth happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think you have to be anti-police officer to be anti the job as it is, at least at this moment, you know.
Well, I think we need to ask ourselves what is different now, because I mean, I can remember growing up, it's kind of like people would make jokes about police officers harassing black people. I mean, Richard Pryor made numerous comedy skits about it in the 70s, but it really just seems to me that it's really ramped up a lot since 2004, right about the time Supreme Court basically expanded the qualified immunity doctrine to say police officers could just use deadly force just whenever they wanted to for all practical purposes. I think that led to it. The ongoing war on drugs that just keeps, the classic Robert Higgs crisis in Leviathan of, Ludwig von Mises saying government action basically creates a need for more government action. It just keeps getting ramped up and ramped up and ramped up.
Right.
And I think that has been constantly ramped up. And I think the fact that our current president, his history has a lot to do with it. And you can go on YouTube and type in Donald Trump encourages police brutality, and you can listen to yourself that in January 2017, he was making a big public performance in front of a bunch of New York police officers where he was just blatantly encouraging them to engage in police brutality.
Yeah.
You can listen to it for yourself and draw
Yeah,
your
he
own.
said something like, you don't have to be so nice. When you're, instead of ducking their head when you're putting them in the car, why don't you like smack them into the car or something like that? Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, that was, and I think African Americans saw that, and that stuck in their minds. I think there was a lot of people that I know, some of my relatives voted for Donald Trump, and they told me they were not entirely comfortable with him, but they were hoping that he would, quote, act more presidential once he actually got in office. And I told him, I wish you were right, but I ain't buying it. I don't believe it.
Yeah.
And sure enough, January 2017.
I want to say it was Michael Malice that said it, and I think that this best explains Donald Trump and his rhetoric, and it's why I don't spend a whole lot of time discussing Donald Trump's, at least what he says, because Michael Malice, I think it was Michael Malice, and he said the right wingers, the Trump supporters know to take Donald Trump seriously, but not literally, and the never Trumpers and the left wing take Trump literally and not seriously. And so I think there's a portion of his rhetoric that is, and whether or not that particular statement where he's talking about don't be so nice, whether he was just, trying to joke around with cops in their own language or whatever. I think that there's that portion you're never going to break through to a specific population of people when you're talking about the things that he literally said, because they look at a lot of those things as jokes but every joke is only funny because there's a portion of truth in it. You know what I'm saying? So I do think there's a lot of rhetoric that comes out of his mouth that is dangerous. I just don't know if focusing on what he's saying in instances like that, where he's talking to a police union, if that's actually, changing any minds. You get my point?
Well, I will say that I don't think anybody's going to change their mind about Donald Trump by this stage of the game. He is what he is.
He is.
And he's not going to change. But I will say is that if the president of the United States or any other politician does not show a basic respect for the rule of law, what message does that send to police officers and other people?
Right.
And I mean, I've heard African Americans literally say, "He's not my president."
Right.
Okay, so and I think that has fueled a lot of the current uh, protesting that we are seeing. I think a lot of it also does have to do with the coronavirus, the prolonged lockdowns that we've had, and for reasons I don't really understand, apparently the pandemic has had a bigger impact on African American communities than others. I really
Yes.
can't say why that is. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't think
I
the
know.
virus can recognize color, but I think it probably has to do with like stress levels and that sort of thing. Immunity.
lifestyle
Yeah.
lifestyle and and Dr. Rhonda Patrick was on Joe Rogan a while back, and she had mentioned that in the African American community there's a much higher rate of vitamin D deficiency, and that could have something to do with it too.
It probably has a lot to do with diet, lack of exercise, and I think a lot of it is just uncertainty about the economic future. I mean, they've had their jobs taken away from them. It's kind of like it was mandated that you can't work.
Right.
Well, for somebody, I mean, you're a truck driver, okay? So you were able to continue working because, hey, stores needed toilet paper, okay?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so you were able to
I'm
keep
still
working.
waiting on my government mandated vacation though.
Okay. And it's a thing of, it's going to sound odd the way it happened, but kind of like in a way, I was fortunate that my mother died when she did. I mean, she was 83 years old. She had cancer. She was ready to go.
Hmm.
But combination of two things. Number one, there's no way that she would have had a prayer of surviving if she had got the COVID, the coronavirus. There's no way that she would have been able to recover from it. And plus, going when she did, I inherited enough money to basically hold me through the pandemic.
Right.
So for me, the economic shutdown, and plus the course mandated that my job was a quote unquote essential government function. So I was still able to get out of the house, drive into Dallas, see some people, interact with some people, even during the pandemic. All right. Well, a lot of African Americans, they weren't able to do that. And so I do think there's kind of like a lockdown fatigue of being locked in as long as they have been. And also, I think that the technology of today, the smartphone technology, social media platforms, they were able to post this stuff. We simply see a lot more of it, the police brutality today, than we used to see it.
Oh yeah.
And police officers more and more are being required to wear body cam video. And I can tell you that when I started practicing law 20 years ago, we were just starting to have the in-car the squad car videos,
Right.
and kind of like amazing things. And it's just there was quite a few cases where the squad car video just conveniently wasn't working at a particular point in time.
Yeah.
And police officers managed to kind of like pull the motorist off just outside of video camera recording. So you
Hmm.
couldn't see what they were doing. Yeah, I saw a lot of that in my early days. And it used to be the fact that police officers and prosecutors in Texas were notorious for destroying evidence. If you don't believe it happened, look up Michael Morton sometime. And just so know it's not a racist thing, Michael Morton was a white man. I don't know if you're familiar with his case or not.
I'm not. Go ahead. You can go ahead and tell me about it.
Well, I mean, Michael Morton was a famous case in the suburbs of Austin. He was his wife was found brutally murdered, and in their house, and he got basically the local sheriff just decided on his own, based on no real evidence whatsoever, that Michael Morton must have done it. And so the whole system basically just turned on a dime and decided that they were going to frame Michael Morton. He was a white man. He was assistant manager of a I think it was like a Walmart or a Kmart or something like that. And he wound up going to the penitentiary in Texas for murdering his wife. He was in penitentiary for 25 years when suddenly DNA evidence surfaced up, and it was discovered that the prosecutor in his case had intentionally hid the fact that there was evidence, physical DNA evidence that was recovered from the scene.
Yeah.
And that he had intentionally, knowingly hid that from Michael Morton's attorneys.
I think I
And
do remember the case now that you've explained it. I think I do remember. I just didn't know the guy's name.
yeah, it led to a lot of changes in Texas. And the thing that was unique was the man that was the prosecutor. His name was Ken Anderson, and he later became a judge in Williamson County, Texas. And he wound up, not only did he get thrown off the bench because of it, but he did actually have to go into custody. And he only spent like 3 days. And the reason why he only spent 3 days is because Michael Morton himself said that should be enough. I mean, if Michael Morton had really wanted to, he could have really totally destroyed Ken Anderson. But I think to Michael Morton's credit, he said, no, I don't want to totally destroy him like he totally destroyed me.
Yeah, I know what it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah. But
imagine if the court system or the judicial system had empathy. That would just be something amazing.
Well, I can tell you that it was very clear among prosecutors after that as a public defender, I told more than one of them, you know what, you don't want to be the next Ken Anderson. Okay, so that led to a lot of changes in the way prosecutors in Texas did their jobs after that. And I think it's kind of like when you can show that you see that. I mean, my hope is that whatever comes of this, that I'm hoping a lot of police officers decide, you know what, I don't want to be the next person that's accused of killing the next George Floyd.
Man, you know, you would hope, man, but I don't know if if you pay any attention to the Free Thought Project and what's going on in all over the country in these protests. You know, they're attacking the peaceful protesters, and the rioters and looters are just, walking free. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, you had that 75-year-old man in Buffalo the other day who, is in, the last I heard, he was in critical condition. He got pushed down by 2 cops for trying to give them their helmet back. Was it a cop had left one of their riot helmets sitting around, and he picked it up and approached the police officers and was trying to give it back, and they just pushed him down, busted his head open. And one of the cops actually went to stop and help him, and it looked like the commanding, whoever was in control of the unit that was being marched down the street, stopped him and told him to get on down the road, and then radioed somebody, like he was radioing paramedics or something. And you're seeing this all over the place. I just read a story the other day about a woman in San Antonio who's being rewarded $200,000 because she was sitting in her car waiting on her boyfriend to come out of work, and the cops pulled up and decided they wanted to search her for drugs. And so they called a female officer over, and the female officer made her drop her pants in public and pulled her tampon out while she was on her period. Yeah, and it's just like, these people just have no respect for an individual's autonomy? So that brings me to the last thing I wanted to discuss was, how do we approach law enforcement? Number one, I think calling it law enforcement is the biggest issue. How do we approach society in such a way that these people that we call police are respecting the autonomy of the citizens around them and not violating their rights and being financially rewarded for violating their rights?
Well, I think the financial reward I could do an entire podcast talking about that.
Yeah,
Okay,
well, yeah, and I
so
mean that gets
yeah,
us into
I could, yeah,
that
I could
moves into
go on and
asset
on.
forfeiture and all kinds of things, which I would, I just real quickly, I would expect that is a result of the war on drugs, right? That was something
Oh
that
yes,
started after the war on drugs.
that was started by no less than Joe Biden and pushing it through the 1993 crime bill. Yeah, yeah, that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm even given some thought to even writing an entire book based on my experience and research on the war on drugs. But as far as
You write a book,
where
I'll
things,
I'll read it and promote it. I promise you.
okay, well I need to do that if I get off my butt and do that now. That I go,
Well,
I
you've
will
had
at least.
3 months. I don't know what you're waiting on.
Oh, I was trying to get people out of jail. I don't know why. It just kind of like seemed like the right thing to do. But uh, in truth, a lot of my mother dying had part of it too. But
Yeah.
yeah, I will leave you with the story they told us in law school of the law student that encounters the police officer, and the police officer tells them to do this, and the law student is kind of like, I'm a law student, I know the law, you can't tell me what to do because I'm a law student. And the police officer puts his hand on his gun and says, like, yeah, I know the law too. It's here on my hip. Now pick the damn hands up and put them on the car.
Yeah.
The moral of the story, as I was told, is the courtroom is your arena. The street is their arena. Okay. In the courtroom, I call the shots. On the street, they call the shots. And I think that's kind of the way it is at this point in time. Uh, I do think that things are going to change. I would hope that I think Justin Amash is on the right track with his bill
Yeah.
to, you know, at least to at least address the issue in Congress
Right.
of what is and is not, what qualified immunity means.
Right.
And I mean, I think if people could get behind Justin Amash and push his bill, I think that could have, I mean, at least raise the issue. And I
I
think that's
I
what you
heard it
podcasters
had
could do.
I heard it had 20 co-sponsors and not one of them was a Republican. Surprise,
That does not
surprise.
surprise me one bit. And I mean, Frank, when Justin Amash left the Republican Party, I left the Republican Party. So that's another story. But I think you podcasters could force the issue and keep it in the forefront, because I've only heard one mainstream outlet even mention qualified immunity, and that's the PBS NewsHour. So I don't know how much traction that's going to get. But I think if more and more podcasts like yours kept talking about it, enforcing the issue and keeping it in the forefront. Because keep in mind, we had two Supreme Court justices even before this happened who made it clear that they wanted to address this issue.
Right.
And also, I think people can have a huge impact in local politics. That if they get behind people like the mayor in Minneapolis, uh, kind of challenging the police union, I think that can have a big impact. I think if they kind of like put pressure on local elected district attorneys, I think that can have a big impact. Uh, Getting beyond the local level, I really don't know how much power, but I can tell you that public pressure does have a major impact on local government and how they do their jobs at a local level.
Hmm. Well, I just real quick, I heard a different moral to that story. You said the moral to the story was the street was the cops, arena, and the courtroom's your arena. What I heard is might makes right. That's what I heard, and that's definitely not the way I like things to go. So, um, I, it's that monopoly on violence is a serious issue. I think one thing that we do need to try to see at some point in time, in some way, shape, or form, and I'm hoping with this defund the police and dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, it opens up the arena for competition to be moving in, and I think competition would cure a lot of the issues as well as ending the war on drugs. So,
well, I think until we end the war on drugs, it's things. I mean, the war on drugs is really the low-hanging fruit of law enforcement. They're the easy pickings.
well, right.
And
Yeah.
until you end the war on drugs, and I mean, we're already seeing it with marijuana, and I think Ron Paul showed us that Washington D.C. is not going to change Washington D.C. I think it's going to have to come. Change is going to have to come as a combination of the state level. Ultimately, what I think is going to really cause a change is when foreigners stop buying U.S. Treasury bonds. I mean, that is what ultimately, when foreign central banks and foreign investors kind of like, no, we're not buying U.S. Treasury bonds anymore. That's what I think is ultimately going to get the power elites' attention when that happens.
Yeah. Well, and individual Americans too. There's a lot of I think I had Mike Maharrey on the show a while back, and that was one of the things he said. He said a lot of people think China is the #1 holder of United States debt, but actually individual Americans hold more U.S. Treasury bonds than China does.
Well, I suspect it's really the U.S. Federal Reserve that mainly holds those in the name of U.S. citizens.
Possibly.
Which, I mean, if you want me to talk about that, I can tell you.
Well, you did bring up the Federal Reserve building in New Orleans, so real quick.
All right. Yeah, I had a federal jury trial, drug conspiracy trial, a few years ago, and I was the attorney that handled the appeal. In the federal system, they want the same attorney that handled the jury trial to handle the appeal. The reason being, they figured you already know all the facts of the case. So I had to go to New Orleans to have the appeal. And in New Orleans, all the federal buildings are in this one particular park, around a small park. Ironically, it's called Lafayette Park. And the thing that struck me when I went down there, and it's kind of like, here's this federal building, here's that federal building, so forth. But as I was looking around, there was only one federal building that had a fence around it. The U.S. Federal Reserve.
Wow.
So I was kind of like the U.S. Not only did they have a fence around it, but they had an armed security guard with a dog patrolling the Federal Reserve. And it really dawned on me, it's kind of like, yeah, of all the federal buildings here, which one is the only one that has the fence, the armed security guard, and the dog? The Federal Reserve building. So I think that tells you a lot about where our government's priorities are.
Well, I think communities, especially the more impoverished communities, need to start doing that to their areas to keep cops and government officials out of their areas until there's serious change in the approach to policing, honestly. But that's my own opinion there. So.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to talk, okay?
Well, I know, Michael, I always appreciate you coming on. I really thank you. I know it's been a longer episode than we normally do, and I really do appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate it.
Well, I feel like I have an obligation to share what I know. So I'm happy to have that opportunity to do it, okay?
Well, I feel like I have an obligation to ask you anytime I see something that needs to be talked about. So you're my go-to.
Okie dokie. All right. Talk to you later, Tommy.
Yes, sir. You have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody.
That was public defender, former Rothbard student, and one of my favorite guys to talk to, Mr. Michael Harris. I am Tommy Salmons. Late.